I am Jenna.
And I am Michelle.
And we were both raised in fundamentalist groups and are here to share our religious deconstruction with you. Hello and welcome back to Behind Church Doors. I am Jenna Lewis, and today I am flying solo. Unfortunately, Rochelle is a little under the weather, so I thought I would take this opportunity and do a deep dive. So, I know everyone on this channel is still getting to know me, but one thing that you learned about me is I love doing research. I'm really good at it. And I like to find all of the facts. I like to get things from different angles. So that's one thing I definitely was lacking in my fundamentalist upbringing, was that critical thinking piece, because essentially any of these groups, churches, cults, MLMs, any of these things, essentially require a certain level of non-critical thinking. And a lot of being indoctrinated into these groups kind of prevents you from seeking outside resources or outside information outside of the group that you're in. So to give you the example, I've mentioned a few times, my family homeschooled me to essentially keep me from the outside world. I started working at a very young age, but I was only allowed to work at a Christian establishment that they were, that they deemed, I guess, appropriate for me. Plus it was off on Sundays. So my friends were a part of the same group. Everyone that I knew was essentially a part of the same belief system that my parents were. So although I was kind of labeled a rebellious one early on in life, I still was limited in my access to information. And restricting access to information control is, I'm sure if you listen to a lot of deconstruction or atheist or cults content, you might have heard of the BITE model, which we can get into in another episode, but that's the I of the BITE model, is information control. And that's definitely a strand that goes through a lot of these groups. I hate to use terms like all, because I know I've seen a couple of comments, people saying my church this, my church that, or that's not true, Christianity, or et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not saying all groups do this. And I'm not saying that all groups are purposely brainwashing people or manipulating people into their beliefs, indoctrinating them from a young age. This is just my personal experience. And I do know that I was a part of a more extremist group, if you will, of Christians. And that's just the best way that I can explain it. So I know that the things that we say on here are not necessarily relevant to all people. But if you look at it, every group of any faith thinks that they're the only true one. You look at Islam, they think they're the only true religion. Buddhism, they're the only true religion, etc., etc., etc. They believe they have it correct. And then if you look within Christianity itself, you have some, I think it's 40,000 plus denominations. Even Christians against Christians cannot agree. And we split and fracture into these factions that have all of these different specific beliefs to those groups. So obviously I can't speak for everyone, but that should be a red flag. I knew I was a part of the Christian faith, and I didn't even know there was that many denominations. My particular church was labeled non-denomination, but once I've done a little bit more research, I always thought they were closer to Baptist, but I don't think that's true at all. They were definitely closer to Pentecostal. So the background Rochelle and I grew up with is very similar. There's definitely some differences, but I knew of Baptist, Lutheran, Methodist, and non-denomination Pentecostal. That's basically all I knew about, but there's thousands upon thousands. So today I want to do a little bit of a deep dive into specifically the branch of Christianity that fractured out, that came to be known as either charismatic, Pentecostal, fundamentalist. There's a lot of different evangelical. There's a lot of words that are used to describe this. And I did a lot of research this week on where this came from. Like, how did this start? Where did this denomination or this branch of denominations essentially come from? Like, how did we get here, right? So I'm going to give you all a little deep dive history lesson today, and I will cite all my resources in the comments. There's one amazing lecture that I listened to. I don't want to mess up her name, Molly Worthen. And it was a lecture she gave in 2017, and a lot of what I'm pulling from is from some of her lectures. She is a historian, and she takes it from a historical aspect and is very respectful of how she talks about these religions and the people in these religions. And so I think even if you are still practicing Christian, it's still a good, lecture that's very respectful of people's beliefs. So, and I know that can be hard. When I first started listening to deconstruction channels and I first started exploring religious deconstruction at all, I would go onto some of these atheist channels. It didn't seem like there was many that were still on their road in deconstruction, which is kind of where I identify right now. I probably fall a little bit more agnostic, but it was hard to find creators that were in the same place I was, and a lot of them were very established in their atheism or agnosticism or anything like that, and they would almost be poking fun of Christianity or the beliefs that I once held, and they would say things like sky daddy and magical being. They would poke fun of these things, and it made it very hard for me to listen to. Now, as I've coming out of it, I don't find those things as disturbing to hear, but when you're in emotional turmoil of deconstruction, which I honestly still feel like I am in, it's really hard to add another thing making you feel like you're either stupid or it feels almost like you should be offended because you so desperately held on to those beliefs at one time. So all of that to say, I respect wherever you are in your journey, whether that be you are sticking with Christianity and that's what you believe, you're just exploring and trying to educate yourself. I think my biggest thing is, and I talked about this on a previous episode, is informed consent. And if you have all of the facts, if you have access to information about all of your choices and options and scientific research and things like that, if you have access to all of this information and you still go with whatever religion it may be, because it brings you comfort or it brings you community or it's something that you truly believe in, that's totally fine, and I completely respect it. The problem I have is indoctrinating children, and the problem I have is not giving open information to especially young people, because that's just the perspective I came up in, and not letting them make that essentially that informed decision is essentially what I'm calling it, and knowing all of the facts and having access to all of the facts. So let's jump in. So first, we're going to start. I'm going to try my best to do this in chronological order. I think that might be the easiest to follow. But before I do, I think it's important to start with most all of the modern day Christianity stems from the Church of England. And that's where we get most all of the sects of Christianity that we have now. From the Church of England, in the Americas, we see a breakout of the Methodist Church. The Methodist Church then breaks down into what we'll later refer to as the Holiness Movement, and the Holiness Movement breaks down into Pentecostals, and Pentecostals then break out into the churches we know as Foursquare. Now, the most common terms that I've heard it would be, I've heard of Methodist, obviously, Pentecostals, and Foursquare. Holiness movement I had not heard of before, but we're going to go into all of this. So essentially, all of this, I was kind of surprised to learn that what we consider evangelical, charismatic, Pentecostal, all of those kind of sects of Christianity are actually very relatively new on the scene. And when I say new, I mean in literally the past century, these have come up and developed. And there's definitely a lot of reason to that, but we need to go back all the way to the 1600s. So this is actually where we initially start to get the breakout of what we would call fundamentalism. So essentially in the early 1600s, this is where we're having the scientific revolution and this age of enlightenment. And we have these people, obviously these bright minds around at the time, essentially doing these almost think tanks, if you will. Princeton was really well known for holding these as well, specifically for Protestant thinkers. And essentially they came to a challenge of a changing world, a changing understanding of science and where we fit in the universe. And we're having all of these advancements happen so rapidly and so quickly that are now starting to feel like they're contradicting the Bible, specifically creationism. And we start to learn about a lot of the scientific things about how the world was formed and made and evolves. And it really starts to challenge a lot of the thinking of Christianity. So essentially, these Protestant thinkers come back and essentially say, we have to rely on common sense realism. And we have to say that if God is perfect, then God's revelations are too. Essentially saying that if God is perfect, then his Bible, his revelations through humans, is true also. And this is almost an example of a straw man theory. I feel like that term gets thrown out a lot, but it's essentially not based on any fact. And it's kind of circular reasoning because saying God is perfect, and there's debate on that, honestly, on if that's what the Bible actually says. We're not going to go into that. But if say it does, say chapter 1, God is perfect, you're proving your point with your book on the point, if that makes any sense. It's essentially as if I wrote down on a piece of paper and said, the sky is green. And I say, well, the sky is green because this paper says that it's green. And they say, well, you just wrote that, but it says it, so it's true. And it's kind of that circular reasoning is what I mean, like when you need what you're trying to prove what you're trying to prove. And that's kind of what they did here. But essentially, this is how they reasoned away discrepancies in the Bible, saying that that it's not discrepancies, that it is just misunderstandings of, the human condition, the human brain. We can't comprehend how this stuff actually goes together. So we start to see this fracture happening in the early 1600s. So that's where we start to see this. But we're going to fast forward, a few centuries, and this is where we actually start to see the actual division of what's now known as the Pentecostal Church. So in 1906 specifically, this is where we see Azusa Street. And I know I'm gonna give a little backstory on that because I know I heard this term thrown around and I did not know what it meant. So a quick backstory is essentially William Seymour, who was a black man. He started to have these, revelations, if you will, from God. And he said that essentially the Holy Spirit lives in you and through you, and that we start to see these from these signs and wonders in ways that we see as a part of the Pentecost in the Bible. So I also, in case you are not from a Christian background, the Pentecost in the Bible is essentially where we get the speaking of tongues from. It's a radical left-wing idea, and this is a part of the book of Acts. And I also learned that Pentecost is because Penta is 50 days after a Jewish holiday, and that's when Pentecost. Anyways, I learned that in my studies, and so I thought that was interesting. But essentially, this is the outpouring of what we call spiritual gifts. And this is where you get like the gift of prophecy, the gift of interpretation, the gift of tongues. I know there's additional ones. I should have written them down, but I did not. But essentially, that's what Pentecost is. So William Seymour starts to get these revelations from God about these outpouring of these spiritual gifts, and he starts to preach them from his own home. Eventually they get a crowd large enough that they can no longer contain them in the house. He's preaching from the porch. It's again a bigger crowd than he can contain there. And then they end up at a abandoned warehouse on Azusa Street. And so that's where we get this term, Azusa Street. I think people just throw it out there assuming people know what it is, and I didn't, at least. So they're in this warehouse preaching, and in this kind of this is where you're getting this very charismatic expression of these spiritual gifts and people speaking in tongues and things like that. And there was a lot of controversy around this. It was not taken in a positive light and from the mainstream media or the mainstream church. So I think that's something really important to note. This first wave of charismatic movement through specifically the United States, it was not well taken. They were kind of seen as a little bit crazy. There was a lot of elements playing in here. William was the son of slaves, and he, like I said, was a black man preaching to a mixed crowd. There's definitely reports of, Hispanic and Asian and white and black people all a part of this group. Well, that's really kind of controversial, especially 1906. At this time, unfortunately, this is kind of a little bit of a problem for the social norm. So aside from it being charismatic and very kind of, I don't know how else to explain it except for kind of freaky. I've been a part of this, so I feel like I can say that. But aside from being just weird, it's going very much against social norms. So this is 1906. So in 1910, this is where we start to see the word fundamentalist come out. And fundamentalist is essentially where they came up with the fundamentals, if you will, of Christianity that should not be separated. And this was miracles, and essentially believing that the miracles in the Bible actually happened the way that they said that they happened. The people were raised from the dead, that there was water turned into wine, that the blind would see, things of that nature, that miracles happen, and they really happened like they were stated in the Bible. The fundamentals also hinged on atonement. And atonement, if you're not familiar, is essentially the thought that Jesus actually took the place of us and our sin on the cross. Essentially, he was a substitute for us, right? And so the example I was always told is that, on Judgment Day, that when God looks at you, he doesn't see your sin, he sees the blood of Jesus. Like, he sees Jesus because he already sacrificed himself for you. That's what I was told in the church I grew up in. So that's atonement. Then the resurrection. There's several denominations that don't necessarily believe that the resurrection actually physically happened, that it was more of a spiritual representation. So the resurrection is a key part of believing that actually happened. Jesus actually died and rose from the dead. Now, there's definitely debate on how long in all different denominations. But then the next one is a virgin birth, that Mary was a virgin when she had Jesus. And then lastly is that that it's inerrant. And inerrant means that there is no errors. And the reason I talked about the 1600s, talking about that God is perfect, therefore his word is perfect. His revelations are perfect. And this is where you see this continuing on. You're saying that the Bible is without error, meaning there are no contradictions. There is nothing there that's not supposed to be, that it's all true the way that it's written. So that's where we get this concept spilling over hundreds of years later into that God is perfect, therefore the revelations are perfect, therefore everything in here is true, exactly as it's written. So this is this is 1910, so this is just a few years later where we're starting to see the fundamentals, which is where we get the term fundamentalist from, kind of come out here. And then as we continue to move forward on our timeline, we're going to stop in 1925. And this is when essentially evolution being taught in public schools was banned in certain states. And essentially a teacher ends up joining with his organization to sue to be able to teach evolution in school. So evolution obviously goes directly against fundamentalist Christianity, right? Because inerrant, so every word in the Bible is true as it's written, meaning like that 6 days means 6 days. There are certain denominations that will say, well, evolution and Christianity they can coexist. A day to God is not necessarily a day to us, but that kind of goes against the fundamentalist version of Christianity. So this obviously becomes a very big pushback. It's a very big scandal at the time, and this is where you might hear the term monkey trial. And the reason is monkey trial is this is where they start to go through like missing links and stuff like that, and showing like the evolution of monkeys into humans. And so they essentially put religion on trial, proving that they should be able to teach evolution in school. Ultimately, they lost that court case. And when I say they, I mean the teacher that was trying to teach evolution in school ultimately lost that case, but in the court of public opinion, they won. And what I mean by that is the defense was for Christianity, essentially for religion, had so many holes poked in it that essentially it really faltered with a lot of the mainstream media. So this was definitely a big cultural event. A part of this is also where you start to have people almost villainizing fundamentalists. You start to have them referring to people in derogatory ways, like calling them hillbillies and considering them uneducated. And of course they believe this because they're not any smarter than that, right? So that's kind of where we get, some of that, I think, ideology from. So essentially, fundamentalist at this point starts to become conservative Protestants who militantly oppose new ideas about the Bible, science, and society. That is kind of the definition that has carried on since this early 1900s. And the really important part is they do not care about advancements or knowledge learned about the world, the universe, scientific fact. It doesn't matter what's introduced. This is the inerrant word of God, and it is unchanging. And it doesn't matter that we discovered X, Y, or Z. This is still true. So that's this kind of the thought process you see happening here. So this is where the fundamentalist groups are not mainstream, and they're kind of almost underground at this point. So now we're going into like the 1930s, and this trial really rocked a movement that was on the rise, and kind of forced it to fracture into what they called mainline churches, which mainline would be just mainstream, if you will, and then also these fundamentalist groups and these almost underground groups that are a subculture network of this Pentecostal movement. Now, you don't have the Pentecostal terminology as much at this point, but we keep going on. So in the 1940s, this is where you start to separate out specifically evangelical and fundamentalist. So before this, the two terms were almost interchangeable, and this is where I said it gets kind of confusing. That's why I'm trying to go in chronological order to make sense of this. That's kind of what I had to do. But essentially, this is where you have these start to fracture into militant versus non-militant. So one is a little bit more less strict on the rules, less strict on the black and white, but fundamentalist, it is black and it is white. There is no gray. I know a term my mother used to use is she would always tell us that like if you give a little bit into quote unquote sin, let me use the example of a movie. Say I wanted to go watch a movie with my friends and they have the F word in there. They're saying fuck, whatever. I think you've heard from previous episodes, I have a little bit of a mouth on me. But she would essentially tell us that if we watched that movie, like just a little bit of cussing is like putting just a little bit of poop in brownies. And that there's only a little bit, you might not be able to taste it, but it's still shit in brownies, right? So she would kind of give that scenario. And that is, I feel like, the perfect example of how fundamentalists think, is that there is no give, there is no sway on what your particular group or subculture essentially believes. So there's no give, it's militant. So anyways, so this is where you start to see kind of that fracture there. So then we continue to move on, and so now we've essentially had this first wave. We've had a very small second wave here. So our first wave is in the early 1900s. We have a second wave that comes around the 1930s ish. So far they're still the groups are still very underground. But then in the 1980s, this is where Pentecostals really take off, where it really becomes a major religion especially in the States, but also worldwide. So you start having a lot of revivals happening around the 1980s, and you start to see this gaining traction and popularity in the Christian groups. Instead of it being as villainized or a subgroup, it becomes a little bit more mainstream. And the crazy thing is, and I'm trying to find this statistic on how many Pentecostals there are, but I do know that by the 1930s, Pentecostalism had already reached every continent. But as we moved further in the history through the waves, we see it becoming the largest Protestant religion in the world, which is just kind of crazy to even think about. And now, one thing, take it with a grain of salt, because one thing you can count on with Christian religion is every time there's a new denomination, additional denominations will follow. So though Pentecostal is technically a denomination of Christianity, it has definitely now broken into additional types of Pentecostal, and this is where I really feel like non-denomination, at least the non-denomination I was a part of, really falls under is a fracture of that Pentecostal group. So there are lots of non-denomination churches, some that are like mega churches that you see. But then some of them are smaller, like the one I was in, that really do have more of that cult vibe and feel and information control. And I definitely see that as we always would, basically, if we went to a church and you were both non-denomination, you would essentially ask them if they were charismatic or not. Is the term we would say. We're like, are you a charismatic non-denomination or no? And essentially what you're asking is, do you speak in tongues? So this kind of brings us to the 1980s, right? So now we're in the 80s. And the thing is that the reason Pentecostals believed that all of this revival was happening, and this does go back into the 30s, but especially in the 80s, it's essentially considered an outpouring of spiritual gifts because Christ is coming at any time. And these spiritual gifts are here to get the world ready for the end times. So if you go back, thousands of years to when supposedly the original Pentecost was, that was the purpose of these outpouring of gifts. The purpose of speaking in tongues was specifically so all of these Hebrew speaking people could go into all these different nations and preach the gospel in their word. In their spoken word. So the concept was, I will get the Holy Spirit, will take over my mouth, will speak through me in another language that this other person understands. Now, throughout the years and throughout the movements, this has definitely language that gets used around speaking in tongues now is what people will call their prayer language or communing with God or things like that. Or I've even heard, I used to hear it explained that whenever you were speaking in tongues, you were releasing your mouth to God to do with it what he will, which sounds really just sexual and disgusting if you think about it now. But they would say, you're releasing your mouth to God for him to speak through you however he sees fit, and that the devil can't understand this language that you speak when you speak in tongues. And so it's like supposed to be this very intimate thing. Like when you don't know what to pray, God knows what to pray and he'll speak through you, which in retrospect sounds insane. And I understand that now, but at the time and I grew up this way. And I grew up with family members speaking in tongues. I grew up very heavily around this in church. And it was just kind of like a part of like everyday norms. It wasn't anything weird at the time. Now stepping back and I'm in normal society, I see that it doesn't make any sense. The other thing that's just like very discrepancy, if you will, if you look, like I said, the history of tongues was for you to be able to speak in someone else's spoken language. It was not for this secret society like language with God. And I know then people started calling it the language of heaven and things like that. And there's so many different takes, so many different views on this. But ultimately, if you say that that's what it was for, then hypothetically, you wouldn't need tongues now. There is no reason God would need to outpour it now because we've got Google Translate. We don't need it. So it doesn't even really make sense for it being in here now, okay? In the 80s, we don't have Google Translate, but we do have translators. And so it just doesn't make any sense of why you would need that now. And like I also said, it's been very much distorted away from that original, I guess, Great Commission, if you will, go and preach the gospel to all the nations. It kind of gets away from that, and now there's all these other things, like it's your secret language with God, and your prayer language. I've heard prayer language. I've heard language of heaven. I've heard, I just can't even think of all the things I've heard. So that's kind of how you see it used now. But this is also where you start to, in the 80s, this is where it also starts to get a little bit more charismatic, if you will. Like it gets a little bit, every time there's a new wave, it just seems to get a little crazier. This is also where you have the dancing and screaming and laughing. What they call, quote, holy laughter is an extremely disturbing thing to witness or be a part of. There's there's being slain in the spirit. There's all sorts of things that are very much associated with Pentecostal and charismatic movements, and I've definitely been a part of all of them. And we're going to talk about that when Rochelle is back. Our personal experiences with what we've seen firsthand. We have a few clips of very similar things to the way that we were raised, so you can actually see what we're talking about. But the indoctrination for these things starts literally at birth. And I'm going to put a clip in here of someone literally teaching their child how to be, quote, slain in the spirit as a baby. And then I'll move on to, and the next clip is going to be of school-age children being basically, looks like some sort of Christian school based on the uniforms, I'm guessing. That's just a complete guess. But there you can see they're continuing to be taught how to react to these things. And this is indoctrination, this is brainwashing, and it is disgusting. It's really, really disgusting that we're doing this to children, and we're teaching them from that age to basically have these physical responses as adults. And, I can say firsthand, that I have experienced certain things firsthand, like to myself, but then I look back and that's how I was raised from infancy to think and see and feel things a certain way. And it really fucks with your head, especially whenever you're deconstructing. It makes you essentially doubt your own sanity and makes you doubt trusting even the things that you can see and feel and touch, because a lot of what you were trained to do from the beginning of time, your time at least, was specifically for this religion. So I hope this gave you all a overview of how the heck we got here, like where this all came from. But I was just absolutely shocked to see that Pentecostals and this charismatic movement essentially was birthed in the last 120 years. And it's absolutely mind-blowing to think that this religion that's been around for 2,000 years or so is still having brand new things introduced as fact, and as this is the way things are. And it's just crazy to me that that's something that my family and myself was a part of. My family is still a part of this. So, I don't know if we've talked about this on this channel, but my sister and my father both work in churches still, and they're both on stage, and my mother is involved. Now, one of my sisters is also out of the church, but my family is very heavily involved in this, which makes this whole deconstruction process really difficult, I feel like, because it's I can't really discuss this with anybody but Rochelle, essentially, which is why this has been so great for us, because there's a lot of this discovery that I never got to do. I never learned, and I never really had the opportunity when I was younger, you kind of are inquisitive about things. And so now as I'm older, I'm going back and I'm like, I just want to know the history of it. I want to know the facts. I think it's fun when we do our personal experiences and, what we've personally witnessed or seen or heard. I love those things. Being able to talk it out loud is very helpful. But for me, being able to look here and see something factual, see something on paper that I can look up articles that are peer reviewed, and I can see lectures from professors and things on the actual history behind these denominations and these beliefs and these practices. To me, that's really helpful, and it's also really validating that I'm on the right track, at least for myself, that I feel like I'm on the right path, that I feel like I am not crazy, that there's not something wrong with me, that that this is something that needed to be questioned in my life. So I hope this little deep dive was helpful and maybe brought some light on the backstory of at least the charismatic and fundamentalist movement here stateside. I don't want to speak for other countries. I didn't go and look up every country. One of the articles I was reading was about Canada as well, and I'm like, it's too much. So I'm in the States. I'm going to go over the States. So on that note, I would love to know in the comments, do you like deep dives? Is this something that, do you like seeing the history behind things, or kind of the educational part of it? Is that helpful for you? If your answer is yes or no, I would love to hear, because we definitely want to make content that's helpful for you guys, because this is stuff we looked for. And though we did find some awesome content creators here on YouTube, and we found some awesome, resources outside of YouTube, but we definitely kind of felt like there was a gap or an underrepresentation, at least of what we could find in both women and people of color. And both of us are in those categories. Myself, I'm Hispanic, and Rochelle is Black. And I think we've mentioned that before, but we're also both identify as female. And I think it's really important to see yourself, I guess, if, for lack of a better term, in the people that you are getting information from. Now, I've learned so much from a lot of the male creators and some female creators as well, but it just felt like we felt like there was an underrepresentation for what we were looking for. So we really hope that in this content that we're making, there's something for you. There's something that's helpful for you, that will maybe help you along in this process, make it a little less painful, and maybe make it a little less isolating, because it can be really hard, especially if you've grown up in this environment like myself and like Rochelle. It feels very alone. And I know I dealt with this for years without talking to any of my friends, because all of them were still in the Christian faith. And it was kind of by accident that Rochelle and I even talked about this. And we honestly would think it was a text one day, and then it just kind of snowballed into like, wait, we were both feeling the same way. All of this is a long-winded way of saying, like, you are not alone. And aside from strangers on the internet, I know you don't know me, I know you don't know Rochelle, but aside from strangers on the internet, I bet you there are people in your life that are actually questioning the same, and they just haven't spoken out about it. And, if I'm being quite honest, I'm vocal about my beliefs if someone asks. I am vocal about it with my very closest trusted friends, but I would say the majority of people in my life personally don't know that I've essentially renounced Christianity, and that I'm kind of on this path of discovery and construction. And until I had Rochelle to talk to, I was just alone. And so I had my husband to talk to as well, but he had kind of already worked through a lot of this. And so it was kind of hard because he wasn't in the same place as me. He wasn't raised the same as me. And so I hope that if you're listening to this, that you're either learning something, having fun, or you kind of see yourself in one of us. So I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Oh my gosh, I talked for 40 minutes by myself, and now my throat is angry. So I'm going to wrap this up, but thanks for listening. We appreciate you guys and all the love we've been getting on this channel, and we'll see you next time.